Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming this evening. It's really great to see such a packed lecture hall. I am delighted to be able to introduce a man who needs no introduction, Theodore Spyropoulos, who has obviously taught at the AA for many years as the director of the DRL program, but is here tonight to not talk about that, but actually to talk about the practice that he runs together with his brother Stephen, and the exhibition across the hallway in the gallery, which is titled The Order of Time, which is an exhibition of the work of Minima Forms, and we're delighted to be able to host it here. Tonight, Theo is going to tell us more, not just about the project, but all the many ideas that have shaped it. And then following that, there will be a tour in the gallery, so I encourage you all to stick around for that as well. So without further ado, I hand over to Theo. Thank you very much.
Thanks, thank you, Manajay, for a very warm introduction, as always. My name is Theo Spyropoulos, and I'm half of what we call Minima Forms between me and my brother. The title of the exhibition and the title of the work, The Order of Time, in some ways is trying to bring together a certain relationality in terms of the way that we approach work, and at the same time, that relationality extending into very different domains and fields. We start the conversation, I think, in a certain way, bridging a certain discussion between arts, between physics, between architecture and design, as a way in terms of trying to situate our relationality with the world. George Spencer Brown wrote a book called Laws of Form, in some ways trying to do the same thing with mathematics and mathematics and philosophy, where he said, draw a distinction and a universe comes into being. This basically sets up a certain kind of conceptual argument for the work, which in one sense basically suggests that everything that we understand in the world is unique to us. And it somehow foregrounds the necessity for communication and collaboration, and constructing a framework basically to engage in not only the everyday, the ways that we think about creation, but the way that we think about living. One of the taglines of the exhibition is called "The world as you see it is your own invention." And it comes from a certain argumentation that was somehow put forward by a group called the Radical Constructivists, which was a kind of philosophy that was somehow negotiating a particular moment in time when there were a lot of questions about the world, where ecology and science and ways of thinking about brain research and computation and all of these things were somehow open kind of thought experiments. And we felt that this was an important kind of moment to potentially also reconsider some of that. So the work of Minima Forms is really a collaboration with my brother and with colleagues, and it's really a platform that has run a kind of parallel life for myself, particularly with this school. As we started off in 2002 setting up this kind of framework. My brother is trained as an artist and as an interaction designer, and myself as an architect. So this conversation, I think, is a kind of dialogue, and the exhibition itself in some ways has emerged as a dialogue in itself. And I'll try to speak to that with the characters that have kind of influenced this, but also to talk about relationality, the challenges of time, the role of the order of time, which is basically taking its name from Carlo Rovelli's book, and some of these kind of notions which I think are very much at play. To kind of situate the way that we approach design and art, in some sense unapologetic that design actually is a very important thing, and exploring the everyday is a very kind of meaningful, motivated way to think about how we can engage. It doesn't really matter if it's an interface, if it's a piece of sculpture, land art, or building. If the problems are spatial, we believe that they are architectural. So in some sense, we try to think about what it means to have an experimental framework to kind of test ideas, and I think Thomas Kuhn said it very well when he was talking about the structure of scientific revolutions, that the answers you get really depend upon the questions that you ask. And I think at the heart of it, I think the issues, the interests in science, particularly between my brother and myself, have always been rooted in the fact that even in the most objective pursuits, we recognize that the science is still subjective. It's still in terms of constructing an argumentation, and either through human, non-human agency, still framed within that kind of way of thinking. So we thought that we would put together some of the work that maybe influence the piece that we have on show, and also speak to some of the references that I think have been very meaningful. Rovelli has been an important person for us because in some way he takes something that is almost unapproachable, in a sense of trying to think of it as something that's tactile, or try to observe something and to conceptualize it in a way that goes beyond the kind of black box. His concepts of physics, I think, are also very important because there's a recognition that for physicists, there is no future and past. Physics is in the now. And this kind of way of thinking about things, I think, is very important and meaningful. He says, we see the world and we describe it, we give it order. We know little of the actual relation between what we see of the world and the world itself. We know we are myopic. We do not see the atomic structure of matter, nor the curvature of space. We see a coherent world that we extrapolate from our interactions with the universe, organized in simplistic terms that our devastatingly stupid brain is capable of handling. The framework in terms of how I'd like to engage the conversation, I think, is very much themed around, I think, the Powers of 10 film that the Eames produced. And at the same time, was also somehow geared with a certain public accessibility of certain ideas. So I'll just show you a couple of moments from that.
The picnic near the lakeside in Chicago was the start of a lazy afternoon, early one October. We begin with a scene 1 meter wide, which we view from just 1 meter away. Now every 10 seconds we will look from 10 times farther away, and our field of view will be 10 times wider. This square is 10 meters wide, and in 10 seconds the next square will be 10 times as wide. Our picture will center on the picnickers, even after they've been lost to sight. 100 meters wide. The distance a man can run in 10 seconds. Cars crowd the highway. Powerboats lie at their docks. The colorful bleachers are Soldiers Field. This square is 1 kilometer wide, 1,000 meters. The distance a racing car can travel in 10 seconds. We see the great city on the lake shore. 10 to the 4th meters, 10 kilometers. The distance a supersonic airplane can travel in 10 seconds. We see first the rounded end of Lake Michigan, then the whole Great Lake. 10 to the 5th meters. The distance an orbiting satellite covers in 10 seconds. Long parades of clouds, the day's weather in the Middle West. 10 to the 6th, a 1 with 6 zeros, 1 million meters. Soon the Earth will show as a solid sphere. We are able to see the whole Earth now, just over a minute along the journey. The Earth diminishes into the distance, but those background stars are so much farther away that they do not yet appear to move. A line extends at the true speed of light. In 1 second, it half crosses the tilted orbit of the moon. Now we mark a small part of the path in which the Earth moves about the sun. Now the orbital paths of the neighbor planets, Venus and Mars.
So the first half of the movie is really kind of zooming out from our everyday into the cosmic. The second half speaks about the relationship from a very different perspective.
Now we reduce the distance to our final destination by 90% every 10 seconds, each step much smaller than the one before. At 10 to the minus 2, 1/100th of a meter, 1 centimeter, we approach the surface of the hand. In a few seconds, we'll be entering the skin, crossing layer after layer from the outermost dead cells into a tiny blood vessel within. Skin layers vanish in turn. An outer layer of cells, felty collagen. The capillary containing red blood cells that are roughly lymphocyte. We enter the white cell. Among its vital organelles, the porous wall of the cell nucleus appears. The nucleus within holds the heredity of the man in the coiled coils of DNA. As we close in, we come to the double helix itself, a molecule like a long twisted ladder whose rungs of paired bases spell out twice, in an alphabet of 4 letters, the words of the powerful genetic message. At the atomic scale, the interplay of form and motion becomes more visible. We focus on one commonplace group of 3 hydrogen atoms bonded by electrical forces to a carbon atom. 4 electrons make up the outer shell of the carbon itself. They appear in quantum motion as a swarm of shimmering points. At 10 to the minus 10 meters, 1 angstrom, we find ourselves right among those outer electrons. Now we come upon the 2 inner electrons held in a tighter swarm. As we draw toward the atom's attracting center, we enter upon a vast inner space. At last, the carbon nucleus, so massive and so small. This carbon nucleus is made up of 6 protons and 6 neutrons. We are in the domain of universal modules. There are protons and neutrons in every nucleus, electrons in every atom, atoms bonded into every molecule out to the farthest galaxy. As a single proton fills our scene, we reach the edge of present understanding. Are these some quarks at intense interaction? Our journey has taken us through 40 powers of 10. If now the
So I think the movie itself, which is a short film, somehow conceptualizes some of the challenges that we face today with the issue of resolution, and some of the issues that are embedded within the work itself you may recognize in terms of some of the issues that are around notions of organization, nonlinearity, relationality, and I'll try to unpack maybe some of these issues because in some ways the conversation that we had with the piece is really also a conversation with 3 other characters, let's say. Rovelli, I'll go into it a little bit further. Yona Friedman, which was the reason why we were invited to create the piece, and John Conway, who developed the strategies of a game of life and spent a big part of his life looking at organizational logics of spheres. So the world as you see it is your own invention, and as that, if you kind of allow me to somehow suggest that that is true, necessitates a kind of discussion about communication, because actually without action there is no communication, no interaction, and these are kind of aspects that we share with Rovelli as well, which starts to speak about the relationality. Now, the issues of time and the challenges of that relative to art have always been something that have spanned, I think, this kind of paradoxical human engagement. If time is a construction, as Rovelli suggests, he speaks about it in terms of a very objective place, that even he says, on the top of a mountain to the bottom of the sea, time is not the same. It's part of that whole, trying to define a universal clock and all of these kind of challenges. They're different, even if those differences maybe are not necessarily perceptible to us. Organizationally speaking, time is the thing that actually brings us together. Within art, the aspect of actually constructing form, or even in the spirit of the naming of minima forms, all forms are really moments in time where we capture a form of understanding. People like Richard Serra were somehow very much problematizing these kind of issues of time and matter, space, time. And this particular piece where he's just trying to capture a piece of lead was also at the same time that he was trying to develop a very different body of work, similar to Michael Heiser on a motorcycle. And these are interventions or inscriptions in the landscape. The relationship to matter, the idea of action, the notions of inscription, all of these things offered, I think, a very important kind of method in terms of the language that was used to somehow speak to this more kind of universally principled way of action. People like Robert Smithson have been people that have been very close to me and Stephen in terms of some of the conceptual apparatuses that they used. Aside from growing up in New Jersey and doing those kind of Passaic walks, Smithson spoke about time and entropy, talked about the nature of things, and constructed kind of relationships with the landscape through mirror boxes and other kinds of interventions as much as he did with land art in their kind of physical manifestations. The interesting thing about Smithson and Sarah is that they had a dialogue, and that dialogue can be somehow captured, maybe most importantly in a project like Spiral Jetty that evolves and changes over time, but its structuring in itself is still kind of maintained as a form of kind of conversation. And here is a young Sarah and Smithson basically having these kind of conversational elements within that. For Smithson, for example, and maybe you can see it in some of the organizations of the exhibition, the concept of mirroring, the concept of some of these kind of displaced kind of elements in themselves were always kind of relational in terms of their context. In some ways, if you see and have experienced the exhibition, you'll see as you move around, you are activating and bringing to something. It's not an object. It's a kind of anti-object. It's basically a construction in the form of all forms of construction. And for Smithson, some of these ideas were somehow similar. The interventions in the landscape were not conditioned by the landscape, but were given form through the landscape and the experience through that. There's a project of his called The Eliminator, which maybe is not as known as some of his earthworks. And he says the viewer doesn't know what he's looking at because he has no surface space to fixate on. Thus he becomes aware of the emptiness of his own sight or sees through sight. Light, mirror, reflection, shadow fabricate the perceptual intakes of the eyes. Unreality becomes actual and solid. The Eliminator is a clock that doesn't keep time, but loses it. The intervals between the flashes of neon are void intervals, or what George Kubler calls the rupture between past and future. The Eliminator orders negative time as it avoids historical space. Now, George Kubler, for some of you may not know, is an art historian who also was very much interested in the concept of time, the shape of time, history of things. And he said the universe has a finite velocity which limits not only the spread of its events, but also the speed of our perceptions. The moment of actuality slips too fast by the slow course net of our senses. An acknowledgement that we are somehow bound to the way that we understand things, I think, opens up, a very important aspect when we start to think about maybe some of the architectural or urban implications of some of the work that we do. It foregrounds the need for the collective to somehow really be at the forefront of decision-making, interaction, communication. And Smithson himself said art not only communicates through space, but also through time. Time may have many different interpretations here. I stick through with the point of Rovelli that time basically means now. In architecture, there have been pursuits really to try to kind of collate these aspects of endlessness, space, time, continuum, relationship to the human, and really to challenge the orthodoxies of the way that we somehow interface. If you can consider architecture an interface, then Kiesler in some ways was challenging that. In this model, for example, that was designed in 1950, it's the Endless House. There's the first version of the Endless House, which holistically started to look at a much more, let's call it universal kind of topology in terms of the way that the space was designed and developed. 9 years later, that preoccupation is still maintained, and it was the maintenance of actually the introduction of curvilinearity, endless space, developed concepts of the endless theater, and this is the maybe more familiar, known kind of image of the endless house, which kind of evolved through a series of drawings and models. But Kiesler himself was also trying to challenge the relationship, and he felt that through that idea of constructing an architecture, maybe in a similar way of how Pasque was talking about potentials of cybernetics within architecture through the work of, let's say, Gaudi and Parkwell, was trying to always wrestle and negotiate this kind of idea of instrumentalization and constructing a space as interface. This is one of his drawings for a mechanical apparatus that he was thinking about. And so this kind of construct and the notion of some of the more kind of Platonic or universal forms, you can see it in the plan of the endless theater. And this kind of resonates, I think, with an ongoing challenge in terms of how one notates, how one starts to explore these things. And this, at the heart of it, had some direct relationships to some of the work of Yona Friedman that I'll speak in more detail. Rovelli is, I think, quite known as a writer and a physicist, and he's made accessible, I think, very complex kind of understandings of the world and our relationship to it. He says reality is not things, but connections, and it goes in terms of challenging the concept of objects, a kind of holistic idea of representation in things, and is really seeing the world as something that's very active and engaged. Definition of things, if it's relationship to fields or particles, space, time, he sees the world through a quantum kind of filter and engagement. And he also brings up these challenges of what that challenge in terms of how we observe these phenomenon actually kind of influence the way that we see things. Physics, in some sense, can be broken down into two sort of camps. You have, let's say, the Newtonian camp, which had more of an absolute view of space and time. Newton claimed that space and time acted like a container for the contents of the universe. And you had relational view that is lent to Gottfried Leibniz, where space and time were nothing more than the sum of total distance and durations between all objects and events of the world. If we remove the contents of the universe, we remove space and time. And so this act of construction, I think, is a very important aspect in terms of the ways that we understand understanding in some sense. And this goes back to maybe some of the things that were attempted to be explored by people like Hans van Forester and others that were at the same time, like George Spencer Brown, trying to understand how one can operate in the world and understand complexity. Rovelli says if we give description of the world that ignores the point of view that is solely from the outside of space and of time, of subject, we may be able to say many things, but we lose certain crucial aspects of the world. Because the world that we've been given is the world seen from within it, not from without. And I think this kind of duality that's non-binary in terms of, quantum ways of thinking and relating to the world, I think, is something that's very important. And it extends also to the ways that we think about computing. And as part of the show here, there's an hour discussion between Rovelli and myself, speaking about architecture, speaking about quantum physics, and talking about the nature of how somebody works on some of these subjects. How do you work on relationality as a subject? How do one explore through the mediums, the tools, the collaboration, some of these kind of very complex ideas? And architecture, for me, maintains a form of complexity that is quite strong, because in some sense architecture is a very human endeavor, and paradoxically it somehow negates any form of explicit kind of universal strategies, because it should enable, I think, a much more human kind of intervention. So a lot of the work that we're exploring through relationality is to basically challenge concepts of the master plan or the blueprint, understand that our understanding of the world is limited and is localized to us to foreground communication, but to open up this concept of a framework to deal with resolution and to really try to understand our participation, which I think is a very important part of how we can somehow share the knowledge of spatiality in a lot of the larger conversations that are at play at the moment. Rovelli states we're nothing but images of images. Reality, including ourselves, is nothing but a thin, fragile veil beyond which there is nothing. And he says without action, there is nothing. He says without engagement with things, all objects are interconnected into a web, a matrix of interrelationships that define themselves. And we may recognize them in a simplistic sense, but the reality of their associations are something that's very important. And we chose to have the conversation as a very private affair, to really try to begin a conversation of how architecture and physics and science necessitate, I think, open-ended frameworks of experimentation and exchange. We spoke about the limits of actually working on some of those challenges, the limits of language for a quantum physicist, the limits of medium for an architect. All of them are in the domain of challenging the representation. A lot of the things that I spend a lot of the time here and with my brother is really trying to challenge this notion of future. I have a colleague, David Green, who says future is a very 60s, 70s thing. And we both share an interest in Marshall McLuhan and a kind of McLuhanism in some sense. My paraphrasing anyway is, if you're interested in the future, you look to the present because we live in the past. And that notion of collaboration and method and practice, I think, is an important one. And our invitation to actually create the piece, The Order of Time, came through a kind of ongoing interest of my brother to deal with methods of participation and enabling, particularly a project called Memory Cloud that we realized in 2008 in Trafalgar Square. A project that was controversial for different reasons, but after 1 year of planning, we were given Trafalgar Square as a canvas, basically to host an intervention over 3 nights. The way that we considered the project was really to animate the space, the built environment, through conversation. And the Telegraph at the time thought, leading up to the event, that this may be one of the most obscene pieces of art ever to happen in London. What does it mean to basically give over a space to the everyday, to do that in a collective way at the moment that was also a lot of unrest? There was a mayoral campaign at the time, a whole series of different issues. But for us, Trafalgar Square was a very important site for the intervention because it's always been a space of communication, if it's for protest, if it's for celebration. The notion of what the public in terms of space actually is something that is very important for us, and we've always tried to develop our interventions for the everyday, outside of a gallery system. And the things that we basically spoke to the ICA was that we wanted to take one of the oldest forms of human communication, like smoke signals, and hybridize that with an interface that people have and feel comfortable with to be able to communicate through SMS. And so this was the tagline, and the research has been an ongoing kind of research over, I don't know, since my brother finished Central St. Martin's in 2002. And we continue to always challenge the kind of concept of what an interface was. How did we develop an intervention that is ephemeral, that's time-based, that exists only as long as there is a discussion? And we went through many different forms, but one of the things that was very important for us was really about how you can animate buildings, monuments, through the voices of the everyday, have conversations that spoke to each other as a collective act of writing space, but also to things that are at times more spiritual, at times more novel, the kind of human element actually amplified. We performed it again in 2010 in the city of Detroit, and in Detroit it took on a very different context, because in some sense we used the Detroit Institute of Art, which for the most part its main entrance is locked during the days. A lot of challenges in Detroit. But what the piece actually did was actually bring people together and interventions in terms of short-form workshops to think about haiku workshops for the children, for people to come and stumble onto this kind of atmosphere or piece of spatial topography. We spoke to the community there. We worked for over 3 years in Detroit. This wasn't the reason that we went to Detroit, but this was an introduction after a couple of years of working on a proposed light rail intervention. The byproduct of 2.5 hours over 3 days was basically the introduction of something called de-electricity a year later, which is a light biennial that's been happening ever since, from 2010. So even the concept of the city as a canvas open to artists to basically reconsider their space as a form of expression was something that resonated with people and offered, I think, a very different way of coming together, which I think is very important in the work that we do. This was at the second version of the biennial. I think they invited over 30 artists from outside, but most of the artists were local artists from Detroit. So I think developing a kind of strategy to communicate and allowing that communication to be shared and actually in the now, I think, is something that has been very important. And it set up, I think, important dialogue for how we ended up responding to Yona Friedman's work. Other work like Petting Zoo is the last time that we actually showed in London. And this is a project that we did originally at the Frac Center in Orléans. And we showed it at the Barbican Center outside of the Curve Gallery as part of a show that was called Digital Revolution. The piece itself was trying to really problematize robotics and AI and machine learning and try to demystify technologies in a way to somehow afford a different kind of conversation in terms of how we relate to things. It took on a certain kind of agenda from my brother and myself and my colleagues, which was more about once technologies exist in the world, you can't really put them back in the box. So that you should really try to explore in a meaningful way how one could sort of engage with these things, humanize these things, and open up maybe different conversations around the nature of how these things are out in the world. Strangely enough, obviously AI has kind of taken control of mediation and the imagination, but at the same time, it's also a very simplistic idea of what that actually is. For us, it's really about not exploring things that are foreign, but even something like these robotic elements with these kind of tentacles could be something so everyday that they didn't look out of place in the Barbican. People would walk by it every day. And I think one of the challenges that I think designers in particular have is to not make too many assumptions about what the public is. I think the aspects of designing for people is something very important. And I think with humility, I think it's very important to kind of engage in the complexity of what that means. So we develop systems that have their own ways of identifying people and responding to people. And we were talking about an emotive aspect of thinking about how to humanize technology. We've spoken about some of these things with a response to Nesta that asked us what the future vision of innovation would be, or the future of machines specifically. And we spoke to the fact that the future of machines would be architecture and urbanism. We speak a lot about behavior, but we see behavior as a way of negotiating both human and non-human ways of thinking about things. The world is quite complex. The relationship to existing context is very uncertain. And how does one sort of take uncertainty and latency and make that part of the project is something that we continuously work on and have been working on for the last 20 years. So a precursor to things like the order of time, in some sense, or some of these projects where there were seeds for some of these discussions. And one of the, let's say, talking points around it was that models of the past can't operate as blueprints for a future. When science fiction has become fact, architecture has to move beyond representation. So the concept of the prototyping ideas, being invested and also accountable for how those ideas go out into the world is something that we internalize in the ways that we work on things. in this context, it was really to think about an augmentation of our built environment, and in some ways to think about how that can be really enabled through the emotive aspects of our everyday engagements. I won't go into too much of this. I think you can find all of this stuff online. So it brings us to the order of time, and it'll speak to two particular characters. The main character is Yona Friedman. After Yona Friedman passed away, there was an exhibition that was being planned, and this was during COVID, basically to celebrate primarily the second half of his life's work, which he basically offered to the Kanai as a way to think about his archive as something that would be a living thing, not something that would be stored in a museum. He has had a long-standing history of a living concepts of museum, of participation, and those aspects of enabling resonated very much with us and have been, I think, at the heart of what we've been doing. The Quadrilatère is one of the museums that was part of this conversation. The other one was the Frac Grand Large that's been designed by Lacaton Bassal, the Kanai, and others. And Friedman, I think, had, as I think many may know, concepts of the spatial city, ideas of participation, and we tried to look at logics that he used to organize space and try to be in dialogue with some of the things by pushing them to a kind of extreme conclusion. This is Friedman when he was setting up in Hyde Park for the Serpentine Pavilion, one of his few realized projects. He has realized things in India and others, but they were very limited in terms of their ability to take some of these ideas and to influence things. And I think this is one of the reasons where I think some of his notions of mobility and some of his ideas of framework and participation were things that we tried to use as seeds to kind of evolve. This is the first version of Yona Friedman's Architecture Mobile. And he also wrote a book called The Order of Complexity. He had a very particular way of organizing space, which used the circle and the square as kind of indexes for space making. And though he says 6 circles make a cube, and he had versions of projects that potentially became more amorphous, the condition of the cubic volume and the stacking logic and organization, particularly because of the desire to allow people to construct their own space, rendered certain kind of challenges between the speculation of what Friedman wanted and some of the notations of scale and resolution. These are drawings all by Yona Friedman. And other aspects that he started to really be influenced with, in particular when he was invited for the Osaka Expo to engage in a version that lent itself to a project called Flatrider that I think is a quite seminal project to really speak about like the ways that one could construct interiors of spaces through partition systems that could be reconfigurable. There's a film in the exhibition titled Choice Machine, and it was part of an interview that he did online on public broadcast, where he was asked if he could talk about this machine for inventing apartments. And he says, I call this a choice machine. In practice, we say there are an incredible number of possibilities for apartments. You can make millions and millions. And if I make a whole repertoire, I will call it a menu of these machines. All possibilities are shown, from which anyone can choose anything, whichever one they want. It would have been a huge book, just full with little plans. Instead of that, I make something like a typewriter. That is, that instead of the book, I made the tool which prints the book. And in some sense, it was an acknowledgement of trying to design the apparatus to allow people to design. And that work led him to the Architecture Machine Group and early ideas of computation with Negroponte and others. When you see the circle and the square, what was very legible for us is if we shifted our attention from the 2D to a 3D, introduced logics of the sphere and the cube, what would seem to be kind of minor moves, and at the same time looking at these drawings that were not very well known. These were sketches for a form of urbanism. One is a drawing that he did for a speculation in Stuttgart. They have no context, they are notational, they speak to a certain interest, which I learned later through speaking to his daughter, that Friedman also had an interest in physics and in science, and those kind of aspects of the scientific actually emerged very directly. So we took that and these notions of the flat writer, and we tried to somehow think about what it meant for high population of interactions to happen simultaneously. We were exploring certain notions of mediation with the pixels and the 2D representations, and at the same time we're looking at concepts of cellular automata, which in some ways were being argued to be able to define almost all aspects of life, if you look at things like Stephen Wolfram, A New Kind of Science, and so forth. Conway in particular for us was very interesting because actually his most famous contribution of the game of life was also his most simple one, but it, through its simplicity, opened up the imagination of many mathematicians to engage and contribute. So it became, in a certain sense, a model for something instead of something. And the premise in terms of challenging things like no blueprint or master plan that I've written about in a book called Adaptive Ecologies, the premise would be that everyone influences, no one controls. And this could be a way to somehow set the terms of potentially how this thing could evolve. I had the benefit of looking into some of the archive, a lot of Conway's correspondence on what he said the correspondence of life, basically filed under life, which I think is also an interesting thing from a mathematician who, when he was asked about complexity, said, "Math is easy, but my cat is complex." These are some of the early kind of writings of Conway in the form of letters, trying to describe the game of life, its intentionality, trying to name things which were naming things as behaviors, like blinkers, and other kinds of ways of describing basically relational gamification kind of strategies, and indexing this in what he called a survey of life forms. I think what's interesting also is that if you see in the diagram this powers of 10 kind of comment, he saw it as 10 by 10. You see this kind of was of the time and of the spirit of the Eames and others trying to set up this kind of thing. And part of the film here that you'll see, we call it A Million Cells, All Influence, No Control. It starts from the notion of one cell and has a similar kind of pull-out, kind of zoom-out logic that tries in some sense to speak to what a million interactions, possible cells, all interacting, powers of 10, whatever, would potentially look like. So there's 10 iterations of these organizations that have radically different configurations. He said some cells will live, some cells will die. It's a similar kind of spirit like Rodney Brooks had in terms of robotics, and speaking to this kind of way of thinking. And for us, it basically tried to just index and conceptualize the potential for a framework that people could participate and influence locally with decisions that were motivated by their own, but what it would mean like to have an organizational logic that actually played the scenario out over time, at any moment in time, rather than something that would be prescriptive. So this aspect of relationality is part of the seeds of how this game is somehow being discussed by Conway as a form of life. And it speaks to, I think, this whole notion of how organization is a product over time, but this is non-linear time in some sense, because in some ways it's not a linear sequence or an additive sequence. It's continuously reconstructing, repurposing. And you'll see that some of the configurations find form and become stable, and others continuously change. And I think this whole notion of what an adaptive model would be is one of the things that we've tried in many ways to sort of explore. You can see the movie for what it is. and start to see some of those implications. But you'll see that some of these initial seeding points over time will change, the patterns will change, the overall pattern language that is emerging from this will also change. And there's probably many different ways of kind of interpreting this within the domain of the architect, but without us sort of proposing too many, we'll kind of leave it there for you guys to somehow take it for what you think it may be. But the simple rules, kind of organizing a lot of this, I think were part of the things that we felt were some of the limitations that Friedman had. And then the concept of choice machine, constructing the typewriter by itself was a very powerful idea at the time. But at the same time, now we live in an age where these concepts of gamification are becoming very everyday. And maybe technology has accelerated to the point where an investment in kind of collaborative and engagements in what it means to participate are not utopian anymore. Maybe they are not only necessary but fundamental for how we sort of think about things moving forward. Those organizations that you see there, we sort of explored them both as 2D kind of indexing and, let's say, 3D or 4D kind of indexing, so that as these systems are growing in kind of 2.5D arrangements, they start to organize and have the same rules that you will actually see in its kind of evolution. So it's not that this is a city, this could be also a bedroom, it could be what I think you really want it to be. And I think the reason for that is that the sphere in particular is a relational object. And so its relationality is its codependency to other things, and its organizational strategies, unlike Friedman's, opens up a very different conversation. And I think one of the contributions that we tried to speak to was the codependency of spheres, like in nesting strategies, ideas of thinking about spherical packing, recursion, trying to think about resolution as a way to sort of take some of these concepts and some of these ideas forward, and to see this kind of notion of the circle and the square, the sphere and the cube as something that through recursion also starts to lend itself. So the spheres within a certain packing logic, recursively subdividing, also introduce cubic forms within that. And I think some of those challenges that we start to see and index through maybe some of these frameworks kind of offers us the insight of potentially how some of this is. So like in the Powers of 10 movie, from the subatomic to the cosmic, it's a kind of attitude towards understanding complexity. The drawings, I think the sketches are probably the most explicit form of description that we sort of showcase. A lot of the iterations that we use to generate some of the logics of the three kind of moments of time that take the form of these structural vitrines were iterated with different kinds of ideas of how we can study and try to understand these things. These aren't proposals of any type, but these are organizations of different kinds of instances of these. The piece itself, and people have questions sometimes about the piece, materiality and other things, is an indexing of three particular elements of it. Sometimes people want to know how many spheres, all of that stuff, but the reality of all of those literal kind of itemizations is that they become perceptual devices. And as you move around the piece, you'll see different organizations. Within the glass sphere, you'll see all of the relational perceptual constructions of the spheres around them. Some of the pieces have been purposefully cut as cross-sections so that you can see inside of the piece. As you move around it, you'll start to see linear organizations and the mirroring. And some of those aspects, I think, that we learned from people like Robert Smithson and Robert Morris were also ways that we could start to use logics of resolution and also the aspects of illumination as ways to start to talk about also the digital. So people ask about why wood. With a fluorescence, the wood basically loses its grain and it starts to look like a rendered object, a simulated object in itself. So we try to play with this kind of aspects of it. I'm not going to show you too much of this stuff. I just invite you guys to go and see the piece itself. The behind the scenes is that this project was made during COVID, and we had all kinds of dynamics trying to bring maybe one of the more labor-intensive works that we have done at a moment where everything was put into question. But it's a self-reflective piece, and it's built on, I think, a certain understanding that is really trying to enable curiosity and really open up a kind of dialogue and a conversation. All of our work as installations is really premised with the idea that they become sort of devices in their own right for people to be curious and to explore. There are 3 small models at the end of the exhibition that you'll see on a couple of plates, steel plates. This is of a project which was a precursor to this one, which through COVID, to be honest, was put on hold. We've been resident artists at Somerset House now for 6 years. That has come to a conclusion, but we're still based there. And we, as artists there, were asked to propose a piece for Somerset House. And we chose to do an intervention, or the beginnings of a research of something that we titled Oven in the World. And it unknowingly had very strong affiliations with Rovelli, because in the same way he spoke, I think, to some of the things that we were more intuitively looking at, which is that the piece itself as a glass object, lattice structure of 3 hypothetical offset spheres, was a constellation of 1,500 orbs. There is no image. It sits in a reflection pool. They have a fountain there, and we wanted to just capture it. We made this kind of circle packing logic. That was also another thing that I think related to Friedman. That the circles could change scales. They're all relational. They could all be different, but they all have a way of packing and relating to each other. Glass is an interesting material to work with, and trying to find ways computationally to think about how these things are arranged in space. The fragility of things, but also the fact that the piece itself has no pretension. It is what you see it is. It erases itself when you look through it. There are a whole series of different kinds of, perceptual elements through it, from refraction to inversion and other elements to it, that start to create a very different kind of relationship to context. I think a lot of the work that we do tries to be very context-specific. These are some of the drawings that we haven't really shown of some of the logics that are around these 3 different, let's call it layers of constellations. And like a lot of things, when you're in the business of trying to make them real, you sort of work through and prototype and iterate, and we made hundreds of models trying to figure out how we could lift things without structuring them, without framing them. Ideas of Buckminster Fuller, which we thought maybe could be useful, weren't, but for different reasons. And a lot of that stuff, I think, and if there's anything about the installation and the work that we're trying to do, is to also demystify things and kind of speak to the fact that when you're working through things, these tangible ways of understanding problems really start to make things much more legible. So the crates that we designed for the pieces to be shipped and moved became instrumental in the ways that we would lift the panels. What starts to look like hexagons and pentagons became these star-shaped elements, so that in the end we had very few kind of connective bits that were outside of things, and things could be completely unified as these kind of mega panels. And it sort of opens up, I think, a very different world of also trying to understand, industrial production of very different kinds of things, shapes, sizes, effects, weight. These things become something very tangible, but in the process of trying to think about an architecture that is completely lattice-like, this was work that we were doing with AKT2, trying to really be invested in how we problematize some of these challenges and kind of offer that up. I show this mostly because I still believe that this is next, and I'm not really sure how many projects it's going to take before to realize something like this, but the desire, I think, for a lot of the things that I do with my brother is almost like a continuous project. A lot of the things that we did like 20 years ago still seem to preoccupy us today. So I think in the spirit of ideas that become, in some sense, obsessions, they remain with us, and we always somehow try to work on it. This is a prototype that we were drilling the glass and developing kind of tools to do that, because there are not so many industrial processes for spheres this big, is a way, in some sense, of how a lot of this work and research of the last 5 years kind of offered up a much simpler version, but in some ways much more conceptually relevant to some of the things for Friedman. So I don't know if I would call walking across the room a tour, but it's an invitation. If you guys haven't seen the show, please have a look. And thank you for your attention. And yeah, hope you enjoyed it. I hear there's a tapping of a microphone, so if there's any questions that anybody has, I'll try to answer whatever I can.
Hi Theo, thank
Hi.
you for the lecture. It was really good. I wanted to ask about is more about your approach to to designing for non-human entities, and what was the thinking behind what was the thinking behind it, and how do you approach it without feeling like you're breaching some sort of sacral?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, I work on a lot of different levels and a lot of different scales just through my association, I think, with DRL and the things that I try to do with students. And I think a lot of the things that we're trying to do is to problematize how we engage in a multiplicity of things. One of them, for sure, is the ecology and environment, how things can be more elemental. And sometimes to demonstrate the human aspects of things, sometimes you take a radically different position. Like petting zoo was an example of like taking robots, which I don't actually like robotics, but I say this and nobody really believes me because of a 10-year investment in it. But you sort of construct an aspect where there are different rules of engagement, even in terms of organizations. Scales are different. The human aspect of behavior is something that's very human, seeing lifelike aspects in things that are kinetic or moving. When it came to a lot of the research that we're doing now, specifically, we're very much looking at the environment and elemental aspects, the notion of ecology that we used to try to understand the notion of urbanism, and even ideas like some of the stuff that we were proposing here with a framework necessitate that you have a much more context-responsive strategy. And context doesn't necessarily mean site. Context can mean many things. So I think based on the intervention, the way that one conceptualizes a problem, I think you, at least for me and my brother, and for the way that I try to work with students, is to try to have a very open approach to how one is responsive to problems. And it's not about problem solving in some sense, but it's acknowledging that those complexities are important. And an underlying presence in a lot of the work, and in the piece particularly here, I keep suggesting that everybody's understanding of the world is their own, but I think it's also like a social responsibility to understand that your perspective, your understanding necessitates communication, but it also necessitates listening. And as an architect, I always struggle with trying to set up the terms of that engagement. So if it was for Memory Cloud or for other things, there are always open invitations. When the scales change and the magnitude changes, sometimes we have to look towards other models of organization. And so the non-human, I think, is really recognizing the limitations of being human and seeing that we're part of a much bigger relational environment. And I think that's where our, very sincere engagement with things like physics and other things. The conversation with Rovelli didn't happen out of nowhere. He had a conversation about art with Cornelia Parker, and he's had a conversation now with architecture. But it's an invitation to have a conversation, and I feel like that's the responsibility of architects, designers, artists. I think we have a certain unsaid, how can I say this? I don't want to call it a gift because people think but I think like we take it for granted that we can express things, but if we're trying to really design for people, and we have to somehow find a framework to make those voices kind of heard through our actions as well, and understand that if we don't understand everything, how do you allow for change? So, the struggle has always been about uncertainty and latency being fundamentally part of every action that we do. And I have to say that creates a lot of headaches for us. Like memory cloud, we had to convince people that there wouldn't be a riot, religious unrest, what would happen. We played every kind of scenario, and you would say it's just a mediated thing. At the time when I did it, I think David Grain was one of the only people that came down, because he would say a cloud is just as much architecture than this pedestal here, right? And so I just think it's really about how we construct our understanding, and that's where I feel non-human agency actually also forces us to actually see it from something that speaks to our limits.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, thank you very much for that. And I don't think it's working. Can you hear me?
Yes.
The translation from idea
Yes.
to reality
Yes.
and the choice of material,
Yes.
how do you make that transition in your work?
Yes. Material, in some sense, I think is something that we try to do with a certain sensitivity to it. So, for example, the optics, the physics of seeing, constructing strategies, let's say for like our use of glass or these kind of things, are very much because they make things very accessible. They're very familiar relationships to these materials, and at the same time there's something different being constructed there. So I think particularly with spherical glass, like I gave this small glass orb to one of my colleagues' children, and the moment that they see their dad upside down or something like that, something changes. It's a function of what they see. Is kind of like what Rovelli says, the world as is or the world as I see it. They start to challenge some of that stuff, and that's what's been our fascination with glass. Other materials explicitly could be something like an atmosphere, like memory cloud in some sense tried.
That fragility with glass as well.
There is, and there is a very hardcore weight to it too. And so the challenges for engineering, for who takes responsibility with AKT, we talked a lot about where we would do the glass tests, because for engineers it's not that exciting to drill some holes into spheres. So we did it ourselves as proof of concept. And I think what we try to do is just be assured that if we have a commitment to certain ideas and we kind of follow them through, it may be slow, for sure we're not constructing hundreds of projects, but we have a good understanding about the behavior of materiality. And from a much more conceptual point of view, we always think material is an inert thing, but actually materials have life cycles and everything in their own right. So we try to not only recognize that, but we try to look at things like phase changing, look at aspects of how things come into form, come into being. And I don't want to say that there's a philosophy behind what we do, but there's a very strong sensibility to that. Even before we knew a lot of this through our research over the last 20 years, intuitively we wanted to move away the fixed and finite. We wanted to explore the dynamic evolving. That was a natural response. My brother hated the idea of screen-based interfacing, still does. And that's why a project like Memory Cloud came out, a piece of spatial typography as an atmosphere that was really hybridizing two forms of technology, one 5,000 years old and one every day of the now. So we're always trying to see things from multiple places, and that's where I was asked recently by Paul, who's in the audience, in an interview about interdisciplinarity. And I don't think interdisciplinarity is something that you force, but I think a project makes certain demands and you have to follow those paths if you want to be responsive to it. And I think sometimes buildings aren't the answer, and we should try to, really come to terms with what it means to really design and create for the world. So it's more of an invitation to understand that there is no blueprint and there isn't a methodology that is all deployable. It's not modernism. It's not about speed in that sense. I think it's about care and sensitivity and being responsive to the world and the differences that make up, I think, what makes it beautiful.
Hello. Hi. Thanks for the presentation. I'm also interested in the concept of entropies, and in a way, like there is a concept of like entropy by Boltzmann, the thermodynamics, by explaining the relationship between macrostates and microstates. Where there's also another information theory version of it, Shannon's entropy, where it now is used prominently for any machine learning models to calculate what human wants to categorize and also what machine predicts. So that distance that calculated by this cross entropy function. But then like this, the direction of this each entropy is like kind of like polar opposite. Yes. One like the as represented by Robert Smith, and where the entropy kind of increases, like the work embodies this decay and the weathering and the indifferentiated state, while this machine learning is constantly trying to categorize every single thing without actually knowing without actually trying to figure out what the meaning is. They just like to fabricate the meaning without actually thinking about meaning. So I'm just curious whether this computation can potentially have this form of life, because as we see in the game of life, it never decays. Sometimes it has this it locks into this oscillation states and never dies. So if they don't decay, can they ever feel the sense of death, or like they can ever be a life form? Does it make sense?
Yeah, no, I think you're putting a lot of things in the question, which I think is nice. I'll try to unpack it slightly. I think one way to kind of interpret that is what we mean by information and data, and a lot of the systems that you're talking about today, I'm not sure that they're really recognizing some of the challenges that Shannon put on the table, because information theory at the heart of it was an understanding that it was a partial understanding of what was being communicated. A lot of the so-called noise is still information. But how we synthesize that and make that legible opens up very different challenges. Today, for example, when you talk about, or colleagues and somehow talk about AI and things like that, they're talking about mining databases or curating, and they somehow construct a language of this that somehow, for me, is really not really at the heart of where complexity resides. It's a very simplistic idea of looking at databases as somehow being a metric or an equivalent to things. I think what Conway is suggesting is something very different. The actual piece itself is very simple to make it accessible, I think. And I think that that's the gift that also Rovelli has with language. So I feel like one way of understanding things, and it was something that I spent a long time on in my PhD, is intelligence is not something that is attributed to a thing. But I can recognize intelligence as a product of its relationship between things. And so our conversation could be intelligent, It could fall into those discussions about conversation theory and all of these other things, but the important part is that it's an action. It's an event in the world. It's not something that's passive, it's not something that's indexed with a certain status and becomes a metric for something else. So I think, your question is a quite high level one in terms of information theory, but I think the way that we operate today is quite simplistic. We apply models that are very legible and then try to monopolize and onboard people through novelty. And I think the danger of that, it brings back all the ideas of representation, to be honest with you, that I don't like. So it's not that, like Rovelli says, we are image of images. I think it's an acknowledgement, and an image is a moment of understanding, but how it's being utilized today is just the creation of more stuff, more images. It's not really trying to understand where intelligence really resides. And so, I don't know how to wrap the conversation up with an explicit thing, but since you're a student here, I can make some time to discuss it a little bit more. But Claude Shannon had a lot of interesting ways of thinking about things, and he had very mechanical kind of maze-finding kind of experiments. He loved puppeteering because he felt like that somehow animated a very different sense of wonder. So even, once again, in the most objective pursuits, a lot of these people were really approaching it from actually quite unorthodox ways. And I just suggest that that's something that we can enable even further.
I guess it's my turn. I'm not a student here, I was a student here. I would like to ask a provocative question. So the short version is, what drives you? And the longer, what drives you? That's the shorter version. What drives you, not personally, your work. The longer version is, if you look, you mentioned Kuhn in your lecture. If you look at his suggestion about architectural revolution or scientific revolution and change, he always try to see what is the current paradigm, see the gaps, and suggest something else. If we look, for example, for Conway, he tried to look at the models of growth. Friedman wanted to suggest a new type of urban arrangements. And I wonder, in this context, what drives you? What makes your work tick, in a way?
This is a very, no, it's not difficult. It's a very self-reflective question, which I think is, I appreciate in some sense. I think necessity to actually also, if you accept the world as it is and you think it's fine, then there's no need to experiment, there's no need to do any of these things. But if you think that there could be better ways, and you're sort of driven by that, then I think you see it as part of your responsibility. Like, I have a very particular take on art, and I have a very particular take on architecture. I think architecture is for people. And I think art, I have a different idea of what Sarah thinks of art, for example. He thinks that art's agency is its uselessness, because in some sense we only speak about utility and these kind of distinctions of art and architecture. But when we consider it as a way of coming together and talking about complexity of things, I think that engagement, interaction, conversation, I think is very important and meaningful, but it's also something that cannot be neglected anymore. I think as soon as you somehow want to create a framework for creating space, you have to give up a certain form of control, which I'm very happy to, but enable other forms of engagement that I think allow people to have agency. So I think that this is very important. I don't really believe in the sort of radicality of new paradigms. I think it's a continuous experiment. And what we're doing is trying to push some of these kind of ideas without the orthodoxy of disciplinary distinction forward. And so if people think we're architects, artists, technologists, scientists, it doesn't really matter. Project that we're working on and how people and how we put things in the world, I think that that's very important. And it motivates us because we learn from it. And I think that's why I'm also very invested in education, because I feel part of my responsibility is to make that accessible and to share that. And I think it's also an acknowledgement that that's not very commonplace. When education has become a business, when people don't actually believe in pushing forward ideas, when people are concerned, I mean, we're not doing brain surgery, we're trying to explore how to be more human. So I think like the only consequence is actually not engaging. So that's why I feel it's just something that is very important. But I don't think a lot of the things that we do are for us. I think that that's something that also one of the reasons why I engage in the public domain and why we've resisted galleries. I know it's in a gallery here, but it's a particular gallery which I've had a 20-year investment. So it's a way of making that kind of legible to students here as well, that it doesn't get any easier. Actually, the challenges are more, but they should be encouraged that there's a community to share that with. And Yasha, I appreciate the provocation.
Thanks for this fantastic presentation. I am particularly interested in forms.
Yes.
Here's the question. Do you believe it's possible to recreate or reinvent a sort of society where humans would be completely detached from forms, time, and space?
If people would be completely detached from humans. I have some colleagues sometimes that speak about the metaverse this way, about virtuality. And I think the power of it is to somehow think about how that would be different than what we know. A lot of the discussions around the digital for me are always trying to map this reality in a different space. But if the promise of early internet and that so-called wildness, but which was proliferating ideas and bringing people together, can be enabled, then yes, I think that there is a version of that. But I feel like it has form, but maybe we don't focus on form. Like when we discuss what we're talking about, we always talk about things in formation. And form is just that moment that we sort of capture to understand something, but everything is continuously changing around us. That is, I think, a very powerful thing. But yeah, I quite like the complexity of the everyday. I somehow feel like the everyday is a very radical project these days, so I'm trying very hard to always, as much as I'm invested in computation and digital things and all of that stuff, we've never foregrounded technologies actually. Because we think that technology is a very human thing, and at the root of it, technia is about bringing forth, it's poiesis, it's something much more philosophical than it is about the stuff that we use every day.
I think that's probably a really nice moment, not to end this evening, but to thank Theo for the lecture and also to encourage you all to cross the hallway and go see the exhibition in the gallery. There are also drinks so that we can continue having this conversation more informally, but you can't take them into the gallery. So please go across the hall and then come back to have a drink. And I'm sure Theo would be happy to chat to you more about all of these amazing questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.